Genetics Section 3, Modeling Mendel's Laws. So we did our bell ringer. We'll look at key ideas here in a second. We'll look at using Punnett squares, using probability, using a pedigree, and then we'll summarize the section. So again, our bell ringer, just talking about selective breeding and some of the things that we go about selectively breeding, and then how you might go through that process of selective breeding. Key ideas. How can a Punnett square be used in genetics? How can mathematical probability be used in genetics? And what information does a pedigree show? So a Punnett square, again, is a model that predicts the likely outcomes of a genetic cross. It is a way for us to come up with some type of conclusion with relative certainty as far as what possible traits or genotypes an offspring could possibly have. It does not tell you 100% of the possibility of a trait, but it will tell you the likeliness of a trait showing up, of an outcome. It will show all of the possible genotypes that could arise from a given cross. And the most simple Punnett squared, a monohybrid cross, that is going to just simply be a box divided into 4 other boxes. And the combination of letters in each box represents one of the possible genotypes for an offspring. So one of the possible outcomes for that cross.
Biologists use a diagram called a Punnett square to aid them in predicting the probability that certain traits will be inherited by offspring. In this diagram, the dominant trait, purple petal color, is represented by a capital P, and the recessive trait, white petal color, is represented by a lowercase p. We fill in the chart by writing the letters that appear at the top of the column and to the left of the row for each box. Any box with a capital letter has the dominant trait, purple flower color. We can see from the Punnett square that 3/4 of the offspring produced by these parents will have purple flowers, and 1/4 will have white flowers.
All right, to elaborate on that a little bit further, notice that big P gives purple color. Anytime we have the uppercase P, we have the purple color. However, we also have what's called a genotypic ratio. So in this case, we're looking at the phenotypic ratio. We are looking at 3 times to every 4 we get purple petals. But we can also have a big P that causes purple, and that is only one possible outcome in this cross. We also have big P, little p. And that is an individual that is what is called heterozygous. We also have little p. So we end up with a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 with regard to our genotypic ratio. So the phenotypic ratio is the trait that is expressed. The genotypic ratio is the genes that are present. So in this case, our genotypic ratio is again 1 to 2 to 1. Our phenotypic ratio is 3 to 1. So, using Punnett squares, in a monohybrid homozygous cross, all of the offspring will be heterozygous. They will be uppercase and then a lowercase letter. So in this case, looking back at what we talked about yesterday as far as P color, we saw where the uppercase Y represented yellow, the lowercase y represented green. So if we are making a homozygous cross, remember the term homo means the same. So a homozygous cross, we're going to have the same alleles. In this case, we end up with heterozygous offspring. And they will express the dominant trait. So in this case, they'll express that uppercase Y, which was yellow seed color, yellow pea color. In a monohybrid heterozygous cross, the genotypic ratio will be 1 to 2 to 1. So 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, and 1 homozygous recessive. And the phenotypic ratio in this case will be 3 to 1. And I've got on the next slide, the picture will help to make better sense of what's inside of this slide. Alright, so each of the Punnett squares shows a monohybrid cross. And you should have these inside of your notes. Go ahead and look at these inside of your notes. So the first cross is between a parent that is homozygous dominant, and the other parent is homozygous recessive. So we do the cross. We bring down the uppercase y across the lowercase y, and we create our Punnett square. So in this case, we have homozygous dominant, we have heterozygous individuals, and we have homozygous recessive individuals. For this cross, however, 100% of the offspring end up heterozygous. So our ratio is 4 over 4, or that also equals 1. Okay. So 100% of the offspring are heterozygous. So in a cross of homozygous parents that have contrasting traits, 100% of the offspring will be heterozygous and will show the dominant trait. Over here in the next cross, the heterozygous cross. In the cross of heterozygous parents that have the same traits, the ratio of genotypes will be 1 to 2 to 1. The ratio of phenotypes will be 3 to 1. So if we cross these two heterozygous parents, we end up with 1/4 of them being homozygous dominant, 2 of the 4 are heterozygous, and 1 of the 4 is homozygous recessive. So we end up with a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So in this case, the phenotypic ratio of yellow seed color, or yellow pea color, ends up being 3 to 1. The genotypic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. Alright, so a Punnett square shows the possible outcomes of a cross, and it can also be used to calculate the probability of each outcome. Probability is the likelihood that a specific event will occur. Probability can be calculated and expressed in a number of different ways. The ways in which we can express them are in words, as a decimal, as a percentage, or as a fraction. So for example, in words, we could say 1/2 as a decimal, 1/2 is 0.5. As a percentage, it's 50%. And then as a fraction, it's 1/2.
To calculate probability, we divide the number of one kind of possible outcome by the total number of possible outcomes. For example, if you flip a quarter, it could land on heads or tails. What is the probability that it will land on heads? Landing on heads is one outcome out of the 2 possible outcomes, so the probability is 1 out of 2. What if we flip 2 quarters? What is the probability of having both coins land on heads? We list the possible outcomes. There is only one way to have both coins land on heads. But now there are 4 possible ways the coins could land. So the probability is 1 out of 4. What if we only cared that there was at least one head? There are 3 possibilities that produce at least one head, and still 4 possibilities total. So the probability of at least one coin landing on heads is 3 out of 4.
So probability formulas can be used to predict the probabilities that specific alleles will be passed on to the offspring. So we look at probability in order for us to come up with a mathematical way to represent whether alleles can be passed on, or how alleles might be passed on. And as you saw in the last video, the possible results of a heterozygous cross are similar to those of flipping 2 coins at once. And Mendel actually went on and he did some additional experiments where he studied additional traits at the same time. And that created what he called it as a dihybrid cross instead of just this monohybrid cross that we've been looking at. Alright, pedigrees. A pedigree is a diagram that shows how traits are inherited within families. And typically they look over many, many generations in order to see traits that were expressed within offspring from previous generations. They can help families to understand genetic disorders that get passed on within the family. Genetic disorder is a disease or disorder that can be inherited. There are certain forms of cancer that can be inherited. There are a number of other diseases that can be inherited. Another example of something that a lot of people look into is male baldness, which plays into some sex-linked genes. So pedigrees help to answer questions about 3 aspects of inheritance: sex-linked, dominance, and heterozygosity. So when you're heterozygous, it means that you could be a carrier of a certain trait. So people that are having offspring sometimes want to know, what is the probability of my child ending up with this disease that has been in my family in the past? And so you'd look at the pedigree between both your family and your spouse's family, and you would try to figure out, is there a probability of your offspring having that genetic disorder?
A pedigree is a diagram that shows the occurrences of genetic traits in several generations of a family. Squares represent male members of the family. Circles represent female members of the family. Lines connect parents to offspring. Filled circles and squares indicate that the person has a certain trait. Half-filled circles and squares indicate that the person is a carrier of the trait.
Alright, so you'd go backwards in a pedigree in order to see the traits that are expressed within previous generations. So if we know that 2 offspring, in this case, have a genetic disorder, we can conclude that the parents both had to be carriers, especially if those parents did not express that disorder. And we can work our way backwards through a pedigree, backwards through each generation to kind of fill in the question marks as to how an individual could end up with a genetic disorder. The sex chromosomes X and Y, they carry genes for many characters other than gender. A sex-linked gene is located on either an X or Y chromosomes. Traits that are not expressed equally in both sexes are commonly referred to as sex-linked. Color blindness would be an example of a sex-linked trait. It happens more often in males than in females because females have 2 X chromosomes. Males only have 1 X chromosome. So anytime a male inherits the X chromosome that carries the color blindness gene, that trait has to be expressed because they didn't get an alternate chromosome that has an allele that would help to mask that genetic disability.
In fruit flies, red eyes are dominant over white eyes. Eye color is a sex-linked trait in fruit flies. This means that the gene is on one of the sex chromosomes, X or Y. In the case of fruit flies, the gene for eye color is on the X chromosome. Female flies have two X chromosomes. Because females have two alleles for eye color, they can have three possible genotypes. Male flies only have one allele for eye color since they only have one X chromosome each. Thus, only two genotypes are possible for male flies. Their one allele alone determines their eye color. When a white-eyed male is crossed with a homozygous red-eyed female, the female offspring receive a dominant red eye color allele from their mother and a recessive white eye color allele from their father. Therefore, they will be heterozygous for red eyes. The male offspring only receive one allele for eye color, which is from their mother, and it is red. Therefore, they also will have red eyes. In the F1 generation, two red-eyed flies mate. The female is heterozygous for red eyes, meaning she has one recessive allele for white eyes. The male has only one allele, which is for red eyes. The female offspring can receive either an allele for red or white eyes from their mother, but will only receive the dominant red allele from their father. Therefore, they will all have red eyes. The male offspring can receive only one allele for eye color, which is from their mother. She gives half of her offspring an allele for red eyes and half an allele for white eyes. Therefore, half of the males will have red eyes and half will have white eyes. Thus, the F2 generation shows the expected 3-to-1 ratio of red eyes to white eyes, but all of the white-eyed individuals are male.
So that would be an example of a sex-linked trait. Alright, so using a pedigree, if a person has a trait that is autosomal and dominant and has even one dominant allele, he or she will show the trait. If a person has a recessive trait and only one recessive allele, he or she will not show the trait, but they could possibly pass it on. So in that case, we've got a situation where one gene is covering for the other one, or one allele is covering for the other one. If a person is either heterozygous or homozygous dominant for an autosomal gene, his or her phenotype will show the dominant trait. So if a person is homozygous recessive, his or her phenotype will show the recessive trait. A recessive trait in a child shows that both parents were heterozygous carriers of that recessive allele. So in summary, a Punnett Square shows all of the genotypes that could result from a given cross. Probability formulas can be used to predict the probabilities that specific alleles will be passed on to offspring. A pedigree can help answer questions about three aspects of inheritance: sex linkage, dominance, and heterozygosity.